The night air tasted like smoke and expensive cologne when Victor Castellano stepped out of the hotel room at 3 in the morning. The woman inside was already asleep. Her name, something forgettable. Her presence, even more so. He adjusted his cufflinks with the same precision he used to adjust territories and loyalties, feeling nothing but the faint satisfaction of a man who had taken what he wanted, because he could. The city below glittered like a kingdom laid out for his inspection. Every light represented something he controlled, some piece of the vast machinery that turned at his command. He had built this empire brick by brick, decision by decision, and tonight was just another night in a life where consequence was something that happened to other people. Victor slid into the back seat of his car, where Marco waited, silent and professional as always. They drove through empty streets where even the shadows seemed to respect his passage. He thought briefly of Elena, his wife, probably asleep in their penthouse, unaware and unconcerned. Their marriage had become a comfortable arrangement years ago, a partnership that functioned on mutual understanding and separate lives. She had her charities and social circles, he had his empire. It worked because neither demanded too much from the other. Tonight would change nothing. It was barely worth remembering. When he arrived home, the penthouse was dark and quiet. Victor poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching dawn begin to paint the skyline in shades of gray and gold. He felt the particular satisfaction of a man who had everything measured and controlled, who knew exactly where he stood in the world and how far his reach extended. Sleep came easily, dreamless, the sleep of someone who believed himself untouchable. Morning arrived with the usual routine, coffee brewed automatically, the news played on screens throughout the apartment. Victor showered and dressed, his mind already sorting through the day's agenda, the meetings and decisions that would shape his world. It was only when he noticed the silence that something shifted. Elena was always awake before him, moving through the apartment with her quiet efficiency, organizing his day before he even thought to ask. But today, the kitchen was empty, the bedroom door stood open to a made bed that looked untouched. On the dining table sat her wedding ring, placed exactly in the center with geometric precision. No note, no explanation, just the gold band catching the morning light. Speaking a language Victor suddenly realized he had never learned to understand. He picked it up, feeling its weight, searching for meaning in its simple presence. Elena had left, not in anger, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of someone who had already said everything that mattered and received no answer. Victor called her phone. It rang without answer. He called again, and this time the number was disconnected. He stood in the empty apartment, feeling something he could not quite name, something that tasted like the first drop of blood in the water before sharks arrive. He told himself it was a tantrum, a gesture, something that would resolve itself by evening. Elena would come back. They always came back. Power had gravity, and he had more power than most men would ever dream of possessing. The first meeting of the day was with Dmitry Volkov, an arms dealer from the Eastern Territories who had been negotiating a supply agreement for 6 months. The deal was done, signed and everything but ceremony, a formality that would expand Victor's reach into markets he had coveted for years. But when he arrived at the restaurant, Dmitry's seat was empty. The waiter approached with apologetic confusion, explaining that the reservation had been canceled an hour ago. No explanation given, no reschedule offered. Victor felt annoyance flicker into something sharper. Dmitry did not cancel meetings. Dmitry needed this deal as much as Victor did, perhaps more. He called Dmitry's number and received only silence, then a brief message from an assistant explaining that circumstances had changed and the deal was no longer viable. The language was formal and distant, the kind of language used when decisions had been made above the level where explanations mattered. Back at his office, Victor found his desk covered with the usual reports and requests, but something felt different. His calls were returned more slowly, messages came with slight delays. Nothing dramatic, nothing he could point to as proof of anything wrong, but the rhythm had changed. The empire ran on timing and respect, on the immediate response that confirmed hierarchy. Today, the responses came with hesitation, with pauses that suggested consultation happening somewhere beyond his sight. Carlo Benedetti called in the afternoon. Carlo was an old ally, a man who had stood beside Victor through territorial wars and federal investigations, whose loyalty had been tested in blood and never found wanting. They spoke the language of shared history, of favors given and returned, of trust built through decades. But today, Carlo's voice carried a strange formality, a careful distance that made every word feel rehearsed. "I need to step back from the waterfront arrangement," Carlo said, not quite apologizing, not quite explaining. "It's not about the money or the terms, it's about positioning. You understand." Victor did not understand. The waterfront had been Carlo's obsession for 3 years, a piece of territory that would complete his own small empire. Walking away made no sense unless something fundamental had shifted in calculations Victor was not privy to. He pushed for explanation, but Carlo only offered vague mentions of timing and larger considerations, then ended the call with unusual quickness. Victor sat in his office as afternoon light slanted through the windows, feeling the shape of something he could not yet see. Dmitri and Carlo were not connected, operated in different spheres, owed allegiance to different structures. Yet both had withdrawn on the same day, both with the same careful language, both with the same sense that decisions had been made in rooms where Victor's voice no longer carried weight. He thought of Elena's ring on the table, wondered if there was connection, then dismissed the thought as paranoia. Personal matters and business were separate. He had always kept that was. By evening, 3 more deals had fallen through. Shipments were rerouted without explanation. A judge who had been cooperative for years suddenly recused himself from a case that mattered. Each incident alone could be explained as coincidence or bad luck. Together, they formed a pattern, a shape that pressed against Victor's understanding, like something trying to break through from the other side of consciousness. He made calls to his most trusted people, trying to map what was happening, but even they seemed uncertain, reporting that orders were being questioned, that usual channels were somehow blocked, that decisions Victor thought were final were being reviewed by someone whose identity remained unclear. Late that night, Victor sat alone in his office with the lights off, watching the city that had always belonged to him. Marco stood by the door, loyal and silent, but even Marco seemed different tonight, more guard than companion, more witness than participant. Victor poured another drink and tried to trace the threads, to understand how mourning could bring such subtle but comprehensive unraveling. Elena's departure kept returning to his thoughts, despite his efforts to compartmentalize it. She had been part of his life for 15 years, a constant presence he had stopped noticing, the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. Her absence created a space that somehow made everything else feel less stable, less certain. "Marco," Victor said into the darkness, "what do you know about Elena's family?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Marco shifted his weight, the small movement suggesting discomfort, suggesting knowledge he had never been asked to share. Marco finally said, "Her father is Salvatore Messina, but you know this." Victor did know this, had known it when he married Elena, had filed it away as interesting but irrelevant. Salvatore Messina was old money, old power, the kind of man who appeared in no databases and commanded no territories visible on any map. He existed in the spaces between organizations, a mediator, a facilitator, someone people spoke of with respect but never quite explained. Victor had met him twice, both times briefly, both times coming away with the impression of ice wrapped in courtesy, of a mind that calculated in dimensions Victor could not quite perceive. "He doesn't involve himself in operational matters," Victor said, more statement than question, testing his own understanding against Marco's silence.
"No," Marco agreed. "He doesn't need to. When Salvatore Messina expresses an opinion, it becomes reality. Not because he threatens or demands, but because people understand that his opinions are built on foundations the rest of us can't see. He knows who owes what to whom. He knows where the bodies are buried, literal and metaphorical. He knows which alliances are real and which are performance. He doesn't lead families. He decides who leads them. The words landed like stones in water, creating ripples that spread through Victor's understanding of his own history. He thought back to critical moments in his rise, times when opposition had mysteriously evaporated, when resources had appeared exactly when needed, when rivals had withdrawn from conflicts they should have won. He had attributed these victories to his own strategic brilliance, his own force of will. Now he wondered if invisible hands had been moving pieces on his behalf, if his empire had been built on a foundation he had never examined. When I expanded into the docks, Victor said slowly, each word testing the shape of this new understanding, Moretti backed down, even though he had superior numbers. I thought I had outmaneuvered him. Moretti owed Salvatore's family a favor, Marco said quietly. From 20 years ago, before you were significant enough to appear on anyone's radar, the favor came due. Moretti withdrew. You thought you had won. The federal investigation that collapsed in 2008? A prosecutor who owed his career to a recommendation from Salvatore's network. The evidence didn't disappear, the will to pursue it did. Victor felt his identity shifting beneath him like sand, each revelation exposing how much of what he thought he had built himself had actually been constructed by forces he had never acknowledged. His empire was real, his control was real, but it stood on foundations he had not laid, supported by architecture he had not designed. He was powerful, but his power had been granted, not taken. The difference felt like the space between solid ground and quicksand. Why? Victor asked, not sure if he wanted the answer. Why would Salvatore do this for me? For Elena, Marco said simply. You married his daughter. That made you family. In Salvatore's world, family is everything. Not in the sentimental sense, but in the structural sense. You became part of his calculations, part of the machinery he maintains. Your success was his success. Your stability served his interests. As long as you understood your place, as long as you treated Elena with the respect her position commanded, the support continued. The past tense in that last sentence landed with the weight of an execution. Victor understood with sudden, awful clarity what had happened. He had not just cheated on his wife, he had violated a structural principle in a system he had not known he was part of. He had treated as insignificant something that Salvatore Messina considered fundamental. And now the support was being withdrawn, not with drama or confrontation, but with the quiet efficiency of someone closing an account that no longer served its purpose. He's dismantling me, Victor said, the words tasting like ash. No, Marco corrected gently. He's withdrawing his protection. What happens after that is consequence, not punishment. Every favor he granted on your behalf is being recalled. Every subtle pressure he applied in your favor is being removed. You're not being destroyed, you're being returned to what you would have been without him, which is significantly less than what you are now. The next morning brought more cancellations, more withdrawals, more careful distance from people who had been close allies. Victor tried to rally his forces, to remind people of obligations and shared history, but he could feel the ground shifting beneath every conversation. People were polite but immovable, apologetic but firm. No one said Salvatore's name, but it hung in every pause, every careful phrase, and every withdrawal of support. The empire was not falling, it was simply being redefined around a space where Victor used to stand. A meeting was called for that evening, not by Victor, but about him. He learned of it from a lieutenant who still felt enough loyalty to offer warning. The heads of 5 families would convene, ostensibly to discuss territorial adjustments, actually to confirm what had already been decided. Victor would attend not as an equal, but as a subject of discussion, a problem being resolved with the efficient brutality of men who understood that sentiment could not interfere with structure. Victor arrived at the warehouse where such meetings traditionally occurred, a neutral space that belonged to no one and therefore to everyone. The 5 heads were already present, arranged around a table that might have been designed to emphasize the empty chair where Victor should have sat as an equal. Instead, he stood, Marco behind him, feeling like a man called to account for debts he had not known he owed. No one accused him. No one mentioned Elena or infidelity or betrayal. They simply presented the new arrangement, with the same tone you might use to explain an accounting adjustment. Territories that had been Victor's would be redistributed. Supply lines would be rerouted. Business relationships would be transferred to new management. Victor's title would remain as a courtesy, an acknowledgement of past service, but his authority would flow through channels that did not include him. He could keep his wealth, his properties, his life, but his power, the thing that had defined him for 20 years, was already gone. "This comes from Salvatore?" Victor asked, though he already knew the answer. "This comes from reality. Your position was always contingent on certain conditions. Those conditions are no longer met. We're simply acknowledging what is already true. You're welcome to rebuild, to establish yourself through your own merit and resources, but the borrowed foundation is being reclaimed." The meeting ended quickly after that. There was no negotiation because there was nothing to negotiate. The decision had been made in rooms Victor would never enter, by men whose authority he had never understood he was subject to. He walked out of the warehouse into night air that felt colder than it should have, his empire evaporating like morning mist, leaving him standing in a world he no longer recognized. Elena agreed to meet him 3 days later at a cafe she chose, neutral territory where neither had advantage. Victor arrived early and waited, feeling more nervous than he had in decades, unsure what he hoped to achieve or what he could possibly say that would matter. When Elena arrived, she looked different. Or perhaps he was finally seeing her clearly. She had always been beautiful, but now she recognized strength in the straightness of her spine, intelligence in the directness of her gaze, power in the careful way she chose her seat. "Thank you for coming," the words inadequate but necessary. "I almost didn't. Not because I hate you, I don't, but because I'm not sure what remains to be said. You made your choice. I made mine. The consequences followed. What requires discussion?" "Your father," Victor began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question. "My father, firmly, acted independently. I didn't ask him to do anything. I didn't request intervention or punishment or justice. I simply left. What he chose to do after that was his decision, based on his understanding of structure and balance and consequence. You disrespected me, but more importantly, you disrespected the order of things. You treated as disposable something fundamental." He responded appropriately. "He destroyed my empire." "No," Elena corrected, echoing what Marco said. "He withdrew his support. What happens after that is consequence, not punishment. Every favor he granted on your behalf is being recalled. Every subtle pressure he applied in your favor is being removed. You're not being destroyed, you're being returned to what you would have been without him, which is significantly less than what you are now." Victor felt anger flare, then die as he recognized its futility. Everything Elena said was true, brutally and completely true. He had been powerful, but his power had been contingent, borrowed, dependent on factors he had never bothered to understand. He had treated his marriage like a formality, his wife like furniture, never recognizing that she represented connection to something vast and essential. His arrogance had not been in the act of infidelity itself, but in believing he could act without consequence, that his power was absolute rather than conditional. "What did you want from our marriage?" Victor asked, the question coming from some deep place he had never examined. "I gave you everything: wealth, status, freedom to do whatever you wanted." "I wanted to be seen," Elena said simply, "not as an acquisition or an accessory or convenience, but as a person. I wanted partnership, not parallel existence. I wanted to matter not because of who my father is, but because of who I am. You never loved me, Victor, and I made peace with that. But you also never respected me, never valued me, never even noticed me except as something that belonged to you. That's what I couldn't accept anymore. Not the lack of love, but the lack of basic human recognition. The words cut deeper than any threat or accusation could have. Victor realized that in all his calculations and strategies, in all his careful construction of power and empire, he had never once asked what Elena wanted, what she needed, what she felt. She had been a constant in his life for 15 years, and he knew almost nothing about her, except the surface details a stranger might know. He had not been cruel, he had been absent, which might have been worse. "I'm sorry," Victor said, the words feeling simultaneously inadequate and necessary. "Not because of what your father did, because of what I failed to do, because I was so obsessed with building something big that I never noticed I was neglecting something essential right in front of me." Elena's expression softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, truly, but it doesn't change anything. I needed you to see me while we were together. Seeing me now, after everything has collapsed, doesn't repair what was broken. It just confirms that you only pay attention when consequences become unavoidable." "Is there any possibility," Victor began, then stopped, recognizing the foolishness of the question before he finished asking it. "No," Elena said gently but firmly. "That door closed when I left. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt. I'm simply done. I wish you well, Victor. I hope you rebuild something real, something that actually belongs to you, but I won't be part of it. That story ended when you chose someone else for a night and thought it wouldn't matter." They talked a while longer, but nothing of substance changed. Elena had made her decision with the same finality her father had used in withdrawing support. There would be no reconciliation, no second chance, no rebuilding of what had been destroyed. Victor walked out of the cafe into afternoon sunlight, feeling lighter and heavier simultaneously, unburdened by illusions, but carrying the full weight of understanding what he had lost. Weeks passed with strange momentum. Victor sold properties, liquidated assets, withdrew from positions that no longer held meaning. He kept enough to live comfortably, but gave up the empire that had defined him, recognizing that without the invisible support structure, maintaining it would require more than he had to give. Some of his former associates reached out with carefully phrased sympathy. Others simply disappeared, moving on to align themselves with whoever filled the vacuum his departure created. Marco stayed, which surprised Victor more than anything else. When asked why, Marco simply shrugged and said that his loyalty had always been to the man, not the position. It was a small kindness in a season of harsh truths, and Victor appreciated it more than he could express. He began rebuilding, but differently this time. Smaller operations, legitimate businesses, things built on foundations he actually understood and controlled. It was slow and unglamorous, nothing like the intoxicating rush of commanding an empire, but it was his in a way nothing had been before. He learned humility not through suffering, but through accurate self-assessment, through recognizing that what he thought was personal greatness had actually been borrowed elevation. Sometimes Victor thought about Elena, wondered where she was and what she was doing, hoped she had found the recognition and partnership she deserved. He never reached out, understanding that some doors, once closed, should remain that way. The marriage was over, the empire was gone, but something remained, some core of himself that had existed before the borrowed power, that would continue existing after the borrowed power. It was smaller than he had believed himself to be, but it was real. Late one night, sitting alone in an apartment that was comfortable but not opulent, Victor poured himself a drink and looked out at the city. It no longer felt like his kingdom. It felt like what it actually was, a collection of lights and lives and stories that had nothing to do with him, that had never really belonged to him at all. The recognition brought not sadness, but clarity. He had spent 20 years believing himself a king when he had actually been a tenant, occupying space by permission rather than right. His greatest mistake had not been the infidelity itself, it had been the arrogance that made him think nothing he did in private could matter in public, that personal actions had no structural consequences, that he could treat as disposable something fundamental and face no reckoning. He had underestimated his wife, underestimated her father, underestimated the invisible architecture that had elevated him, and paid for those underestimations with everything he thought he had built. But in losing everything, he had gained something unexpected: clarity, honesty, the burden of accurate self-knowledge. He was not the man he had believed himself to be, not the king of any empire, not the master of any destiny. He was simply Victor Castellano, a man of moderate abilities and ordinary ambitions who had been given extraordinary opportunities and squandered them through neglect and arrogance. The recognition was humbling but also freeing, removing the pressure to maintain an identity that had never been real. The city glittered outside his window, indifferent to his fall, unconcerned with his revelations. Somewhere out there, Elena was building a new life, finding what she needed without him. Somewhere out there, Salvatore Messina was maintaining the invisible order that few people knew existed, making calculations and adjustments that would shape futures without the participants ever understanding the forces moving them. And here Victor sat, stripped of borrowed power, facing the rest of his life with resources he actually possessed, rather than foundations he had never built. It was not the ending he had imagined. There was no redemption arc, no triumphant return, no moment where everything he had lost was restored through wisdom gained. Some things once broken stayed broken. Some consequences could not be undone through insight or apology or even genuine change. He had spent a night doing something he thought was insignificant, and by morning had lost everything that mattered, and no amount of understanding would restore what that casual cruelty had destroyed. Victor finished his drink and set the glass down carefully, the small gesture somehow significant. Tomorrow he would wake up and continue building whatever came next. It would be smaller than what he had lost, less impressive, less intoxicating, but it would be his, built on honest foundations with resources he actually controlled. There was dignity in that, perhaps more dignity than there had been in commanding a borrowed empire. The night deepened around him, quiet and unremarkable. Victor sat in the darkness thinking about the choices that led him here, understanding finally what he should have understood 15 years ago when Elena's ring had first slipped onto her finger. Marriage was not just ceremony or convenience or social arrangement. It was foundation, architecture, the invisible structure that held other structures in place. He had treated it as decoration and learned too late that it was actually the cornerstone, and removing a cornerstone caused everything built upon it to collapse. There would be no reversing what had been done, no reclaiming what had been lost. The empire was gone, the marriage was finished, the power that defined him for 20 decades existed now in memory and cautionary tales others would tell. But he remained, smaller than he thought he was, but more real, stripped of illusion, but gaining reality in exchange. It was not the life he would have chosen, but it was the life his choices had created, and he would live it as much grace as he could manage.